The dawn of September 19, 1944, near the French town of Rewrote, was not illuminated by the sun, but swallowed whole by a thick, impenetrable white fog. It was a blindness that felt deliberate, as if the very earth of Lorraine was conspiring to shroud the movements of the coming steel beasts. In this eerie silence, broken only by the distant, muffled cough of engines, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion strained his ears. His command, a pitifully small force of just 4 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, was dug in along a rise designated Hill 246. Their mission, handed down with urgent desperation, was to act as a tripwire for the entire left flank of the advancing 4th Armored Division. Intelligence whispered of a powerful German Panzer brigade, fresh and furious, pushing through the mist, and Leiper knew what that meant: Panthers. The German Mark V Panther was a masterpiece of terror, with sloped frontal armor practically invincible to most American guns at range, and a high-velocity cannon that could punch through any Allied tank with ease. Leiper's Hellcats, in comparison, were viewed by many in their own army with skeptical contempt. They were all engine and gun on a lightly armored chassis, their doctrine one of shoot and scoot, relying on speed over protection. But speed meant nothing in this fog. As the mist pressed in, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards, the M18's greatest asset was neutralized. Leiper and his crews were no longer hunters. They were stationary targets, waiting in the white void for an enemy they couldn't see, in machines their own commanders privately called death traps. This wasn't a battle. It was a sacrificial delay action, and every man on Hill 246 knew it. The metallic scent of damp oil and cold earth filled the cramped interior of Leiper's command Hellcat. His breath fogged in the cold air. Around him, 3 other vehicles, their crews tense and silent, were invisible ghosts in the pall. The only world was the few yards of muddy French ground they could see, the earphones crackling with static, and the crushing weight of the unknown. Then a new sound cut through the mist, not the familiar rumble of Sherman tanks, but the deeper, sharper diesel growl of German Maybach engines. It was close, too close. A shape began to coalesce in the white soup, first as a darker shadow, then resolving into the unmistakable, deadly silhouette of a panther, its long 75mm gun probing forward like a serpent's tongue. It emerged not as part of a distant formation, but almost on top of them, a colossus materializing from a nightmare. In that heart-stopping moment, the entire theoretical doctrine of the tank destroyer force faced its brutal, real-world test. There was no room for maneuver, no chance for a high-speed flanking run. It was a close-range ambush in a blinding cupboard. Sergeant Francis X. Graziak, in the lead Hellcat, didn't wait for orders. The textbook said to aim for the flanks, but at this range, the Panther's side was a massive, vulnerable target. His gunner, Corporal John Zach Zaczynski, traversed the turret with shocking speed, the Hellcat's one unquestionable advantage. The first 76mm shell screamed out, not at the frontal glacis, but at the Panther's track and drive wheel. A sharp crack, a shower of sparks and metal. The German tank lurched, momentarily crippled. The second shot, loaded with frantic precision, slammed into its side armor. A flash of orange erupted from within, followed by a secondary explosion that tore the Panther apart and momentarily chased the fog away with its hellish light. The first kill was a shocking, violent miracle. But as the echo of the blast died, it was replaced by a new, more terrifying sound, the growl of not one, but dozens of engines surrounding them in the fog. The tripwire had been sprung, and the 4 Hellcats were now the only thing standing between a panzer brigade and the heart of the American command. The M18 Hellcat was not born from tactical wisdom forged on battlefields, but from a pre-war American philosophy that bordered on heresy. The belief that the best defense against a tank was not a heavier tank, but a faster, specialized gun on wheels. This was the radical brainchild of officers like General Bruce C. Clark and the driven engineers at Buick, who created a vehicle that defied every instinct of armored warfare. While the Germans and Soviets built ever heavier behemoths like Panthers and Tigers, the U.S. Tank Destroyer Command bet everything on speed, mechanical reliability, and rapid deployment. The resulting M18 was a marvel of automotive engineering. Its 400 horsepower radial engine could propel its 20-ton frame at a staggering 55 miles per hour, a speed no contemporary tank could match. But this came at a devastating cost. To achieve such velocity, armor was sacrificed to the point of absurdity. At just 13 millimeters at its thickest on the frontal mantlet, the Hellcat's protection was laughable. It could be pierced by heavy machine guns and virtually any artillery fragment. Its main weapon, the 76mm M1 gun, was adequate, but often struggled against the frontal armor of late-war German beasts. To the infantry and tank crews they were meant to support, the Hellcat looked like a death trap, a thinly skinned, oversized target that promised a fiery end for its five-man crew. The doctrine demanded near superhuman discipline: spot the enemy first, strike from ambush with a few rapid shots, and then retreat at speed before the enemy could return fire. It was a theory of warfare that required perfect intelligence, ideal terrain, and flawless execution, conditions that almost never existed in the chaotic, muddy hell of the European front. By the time of the Rewrote battles, many in the U.S. Army considered the entire tank destroyer branch a failed experiment, with the M18 as its most vulnerable and desperate symbol. Yet within this flawed doctrine and maligned machine lay a kernel of brutal, unexpected genius that only combat could reveal. The Hellcat's speed was not just for running away. It was for achieving positional dominance, getting to the crucial flank, the hidden woodline, the reverse slope faster than the enemy could anticipate. Its light weight and low silhouette made it a master of concealment. Most critically, its turret, the only American turret capable of a full 360-degree traverse, was hydraulically powered and could spin with terrifying agility. In a close-range duel, the crew that got the first aimed shot off usually won, and the Hellcat could swing its gun onto target seconds faster than any German tank with its cumbersome manual traverse. The crews of the 704th, like Lieutenant Leiper's men, had trained relentlessly on this single lethal advantage. They knew their 76mm gun couldn't win a slugging match. Their survival depended on transforming every engagement into an ambush, on using confusion and terrain as their true armor. The dense fog at Rewrote, which seemed to neutralize their speed, had inadvertently created the perfect ambush environment, a chaotic, point-blank range where their rapid turret traverse and low profile became paramount. The doctrine was being tested not in the textbook perfect conditions its architects imagined, but in a nightmarish close-quarters brawl where its core tenets, first look, first shot, first kill, were the only things that mattered. As more Panther shapes loomed in the mist, the theoretical debate ended. The four Hellcats were about to prove whether speed and agility could truly defeat steel and firepower in a fight to the death. The monster emerged from the wall of white, not as a distant threat, but as an immediate, crushing presence. One moment, the world was limited to the dripping grass and the muffled rumble of unseen engines. The next, the angular, predatory silhouette of a Panther Ausf G filled the viewfinder of Corporal Zach's telescopic sight, its long 7.5-centimeter KWK-42 gun seeming to point directly at the heart of Sergeant Stacy Greziak's Hellcat. Distance was irrelevant in the fog. It was there, less than 100 yards away, a colossal 45-ton specter of German engineering. Inside the M18, time didn't slow, it fractured into a series of hyper-focused, instinctual actions. The German tank's commander, likely just as startled, was traversing his turret, a slow, mechanical hunt for the source of the American engines he'd heard. Grziak didn't give the order. He simply keyed the intercom and growled, "Track!" It was the distilled essence of their forbidden doctrine: never fight fair. The Panther's frontal glacis was a mathematical impossibility for their 76mm shell, but its side, visible at this oblique angle, and its delicate running gear were not. Zach's foot hovered over the firing pedal as the gunner's crosshairs settled not on the armored citadel, but on the forward drive sprocket. The breath of every man in the crew hitched. Then the world exploded in sound and fury. The crash of the 76mm gun was deafening in the enclosed space, a physical punch to the chest. The shell, a tungsten-cored HVAP round they'd been hoarding for an emergency, streaked across the short gap. It struck the Panther's front sprocket and track link with a cataclysmic shriek of tearing metal. The German tank jerked violently, its left track snapping and whipping like a severed tendon, immobilizing it instantly. A geyser of dirt erupted beside it as the Panther's gunner, reacting with trained speed, fired blind at the muzzle flash. The round missed by feet, but the blast wave rattled the Hellcat. "Again, flank!" Grziak yelled. The hydraulic turret whined as Zach traversed a few degrees, the sight picture now capturing the Panther's full, vulnerable side profile. The loader, Private Ken Kramarik, had already slammed another precious HVAP round home. Up! The second shot was a surgeon's strike. It pierced the thinner side armor just behind the turret, near the engine compartment. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then a jet of flame licked from the puncture hole, followed by a secondary explosion as stored ammunition cooked off. The Panther's hatches blew open, and a single burning figure tumbled out before being consumed by the roaring inferno that engulfed the steel giant. The fog, seared back by the heat of the burning tank, revealed a horrifying and triumphant tableau. One of the most feared weapons of the war, reduced to a crackling pyre, felled not by a superior tank, but by a faster gun and a crew who knew how to exploit a single fleeting second of vulnerability. The first kill was a violent revelation. It proved their machine's brutal logic. But the triumphant roar in their ears was immediately drowned out by a new, chilling reality: the deep-throated growl of multiple Maybach engines, now clearly converging on their position from multiple directions in the fog. They had drawn first blood, and the entire pack was now alerted. The burning Panther became a gruesome lighthouse in the fog, its pyre casting flickering, dancing shadows that only made the surrounding whiteness more profound and terrifying. But it was also a beacon of death for the other Hellcats. The doctrine was now in motion. Lieutenant Leiper, his voice a crackling, calm imperative over the radio, orchestrated a symphony of violence from his stationary command post. "All units, hold position, engage targets of opportunity, fire and hold." The order was counterintuitive. They were not to scoot after shooting. In this zero-visibility brawl, movement meant becoming a lost, noisy target. Their safety lay in silence and dispersion. From their hidden positions, spaced a few hundred yards apart along the crest of Hill 246, the other three M18s became lethal ghosts. Another Panther, drawn to the fate of its commander, loomed out of the mist, its turret swiveling toward the closest Hellcat. Before its gunner could find his mark, a 76mm shell from a different direction entirely smashed into its flank. The German tank shuddered, erupted into flames, and added its own smoke to the choking haze. The Germans were now trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The fog that had concealed their advance now concealed their hunters. They were being methodically gutted by an enemy they couldn't locate, hearing only the sharp, disembodied crack of guns from multiple angles, seeing only the fiery wrecks of their comrades materialize one by one in the murk.
Inside each M18, the world narrowed to the view through the gun sight and the rhythmic, frantic ballet of the crew. Loader, gunner, commander, their actions became a single, seamless organism of destruction. The mantra was simple. See a shape, identify the flank, fire, and immediately cease fire, letting the fog swallow them again. The Germans, trained for orderly armored engagements, were completely disoriented. Their superior guns and armor were useless. Some Panthers began firing wildly into the mist, wasting precious ammunition on phantoms. Others, in a fatal mistake, stopped to try to locate the threat, becoming perfect stationary targets. The American crews exploited every second of German hesitation. A round would ricochet off a Panther's thick gun mantlet with a shower of sparks, causing the crew to button up in panic, only for a follow-up shot to slice into the thinner side armor as the turret turned away. The fog, an impartial shroud, began to mingle with the acrid, greasy smoke of burning diesel, rubber, and flesh. The battlefield transformed into a claustrophobic, sound-distorting chamber of echoes, gunfire, and screaming metal. For nearly 20 nightmarish minutes, the 4 American vehicles, operating more like a band of predatory artillery pieces than tanks, dominated the landscape. They were not winning through strength, but through a perfect, brutal application of their designed role: ambush. The very element meant to neutralize them had become their greatest ally, turning the armored might of a panzer brigade into blind, confused giants stumbling into a slaughterhouse.
The doctrine's brutal arithmetic was about to be paid in full. The advantage gifted by the fog was fleeting. As the mist began to thin, dissolving into ragged tendrils, the battlefield was unveiled in horrifying increments. The price for their early success became visible. One of the 4 Hellcats, commanded by Sergeant Arthur C. Curry, had been positioned in a shallow depression that was now exposed as the white veil lifted. A Panther from a second wave, its commander spotting the low silhouette, had time to aim. The 75mm high-velocity shell struck with the sound of a titanic bell being rung once. It did not merely penetrate the Hellcat's pitiful frontal armor, it obliterated it. The shell passed through the driver's compartment and detonated inside the fighting chamber. There was no graceful explosion, no slow brew-up of fire. The M18's hull was instantly filled with superheated shards of steel, vaporized hydraulic fluid, and molten fragments of its own ammunition. The vehicle's lightweight construction, its greatest asset, became its coffin, containing the cataclysm for a microsecond before hatches blew open and a jet of flame shot 20 feet into the air. Inside, the 5 men, Curry, his gunner, driver, loader, and assistant driver, were killed so instantly that the concept of suffering did not apply. One moment they were a crew, the next they were simply gone, their existence erased within the blackening steel shell. The sight of the burning Hellcat sent a visceral shock through the remaining crews. The theoretical vulnerability they had lived with for months was now a concrete, smoking reality. The exchange rate, a Hellcat for multiple Panthers, was tragically valid in tactical reports, but in the mud of Hill 246, it felt like a catastrophic loss. The balance of the fight had irrevocably shifted. They were no longer hidden hunters. They were down to 3 vehicles, their positions becoming known, facing an enemy now able to see and range them properly. A paralyzing silence, heavier than the previous gunfire, settled over Lieutenant Leiper's command vehicle. The radio, moments ago a channel for terse commands, carried only the ragged breathing of men confronting their own mortality. The abstract notion of speed as armor had just been proven a lie in static defense. Leiper understood the psychological precipice they stood upon. To freeze was to die, one by one, in their shallow scrapes. The doctrine had a second, often overlooked clause, the scoot. If you could no longer kill from concealment, you had to vanish. All units, displace, Leiper barked, his voice stripping away the shock. Alternating cover,
Grisiak, move first. Head for the reverse slope east by the orchard. We'll cover you." This was the gamble. Starting an engine and moving now made them audible and visible targets, but to stay was certain death. Sergeant Grisiak's Hellcat roared to life, its tracks throwing up great clods of earth as it reversed out of its position, pivoted, and dashed downhill. Almost immediately, a German machine gun stitched the ground behind it, and a Panther round gouged a crater where it had just been. But the speed was real. The M18 accelerated like a race car, zigzagging and disappearing into a fold in the ground before the German gunner could reload. One by one, under covering fire from the others, the remaining Hellcats executed this desperate dance. They were no longer holding a line. They were fighting a running survival action, using every dip, hedge, and wreck for cover, forcing the Panthers to constantly reset their aim. The blood had been paid. Now the speed, their last most vital currency, was all they had left to spend.
The dissipation of the fog was not a gentle unveiling, but a cruel, gradual stripping away of their only advantage. The white blanket, which had cloaked their positions and confined the battle to a chaotic, intimate brawl, began to shred and retreat into the low ground. As visibility stretched from 100 to 300, then to 500 yards, the nature of the fight transformed with terrifying speed. The Hellcats' world expanded from a close-quarters nightmare to a vast, deadly shooting gallery where they were the exposed targets. The German Panthers, no longer blind, could now employ their greatest strengths, their superior optics, and the devastating long-range accuracy of their KWK-42 guns. A new, more methodical kind of terror began. Where before the Germans had fired blindly at muzzle flashes, now they could track the dust trails of the moving M18s. A solid shot from a Panther could now reach out and touch them from distances where the Hellcat's 76mm gun was marginally effective at best. Lieutenant Leiper's command to displace became a continuous, desperate game of lethal hide-and-seek. The remaining 3 Hellcats were now in constant motion, their engines screaming under the strain. They would dart from one patch of cover, a shattered farm wall, a leafy hedgerow, a shallow depression, fire a single hurried shot at a Panther's flank, and then bolt before the inevitable return fire obliterated their position. This was the shoot-and-scoot doctrine in its purest, most desperate form. It was a battle fought in seconds and yards, where stopping for more than one shot was an invitation to die. The battlefield, once silent but for nearby engines, now echoed with the distinct high-velocity crack of German armor-piercing rounds passing overhead or slamming into the earth around them, throwing up fountains of dirt and stone. The American crew's survival now depended on a perverse inversion of tank combat. They rejected every instinct to stand and fight. Their goal was not to achieve killing positions, but to create fleeting moments of uncertainty for the German gunners. Driver and commander became a single unit, the commander's eyes scanning for the next scrap of cover, while the driver pushed the machine to its mechanical limits, exploiting the Hellcat's agility to make sharp, unpredictable turns. The gunner, stabilized only by his own skill in the bouncing, jolting vehicle, had to acquire, aim, and fire at a target that was also moving. It was an exhausting, nerve-shredding ballet performed under a hail of high-explosive and armor-piercing steel. The psychological pressure was immense. Each near miss, each whang of a ricochet off their hull was a reminder of their paper-thin existence. Yet in this frantic defense, they continued to score kills. A Panther, distracted by one Hellcat's dash, would expose its side to another that had just halted on a slight rise. A quick shot to the track, a follow-up into the flank, and another column of smoke would join the greasy pall hanging over the field. The battle was no longer about holding a line, but about surviving minute to minute, trading space for time and making the Germans pay for every yard they advanced towards the vital American command posts in the rear. The fog had hidden them. Now only speed and cunning could. The critical shift did not come from a dramatic reinforcement, but from the cumulative psychological toll inflicted by the 3 surviving Hellcats. Their frantic, high-speed duel had achieved the unthinkable. It had stalled the momentum of an entire panzer brigade. The German attack, designed as a sharp, decisive thrust, had degenerated into a confused, piecemeal engagement against an enemy they could not pin down. As the afternoon wore on, the Panthers began to exhibit caution, even hesitation. The sight of so many of their own number burning across the field, victims of an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, began to erode their offensive spirit. Lieutenant Leiper, sensing the change in tempo, seized the moment. His voice, crackling with static but firm, came over the radio. "All units, converge on my position. We're going to push them back from the eastern crest." It was a breathtakingly audacious order. 3 lightly armored vehicles were now transitioning from a desperate defense to a localized counterattack. Using the last of their speed and the now familiar terrain, the Hellcats began to work in a loose, aggressive formation, no longer just reacting, but actively hunting. They used the rolling landscape to appear on a flank, fire a volley, and disappear before the heavier Panthers could fully respond. This newfound aggression, emerging from what the Germans perceived as a shattered defensive line, created the illusion of greater American strength. It was a masterful bluff played with live steel. The final, decisive factor was the arrival of long-awaited, if limited, support. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division's reserve, having navigated through the fog and confusion, finally reached the southern edge of the battlefield. While their 75mm guns were also outmatched by the Panzer's front armor, their presence multiplied the German commander's problems. He now faced a credible threat from multiple directions. More importantly, American artillery observers, now with clear sight lines, began to rain down concentrated fire on the German assembly areas and lines of retreat. Under this combined pressure, the relentless harassment of the Hellcats, the arrival of enemy tanks, and the crashing artillery barrages, the German will to continue the assault broke. One by one, then in groups, the surviving Panthers began to withdraw, retreating back into the misty woods from which they had emerged. The field fell silent, save for the crackle of burning wrecks and the distant thunder of guns. Hill 246, the inconsequential rise that had been the day's objective, remained firmly in American hands. The line had held, not by a wall of armor, but by the speed, cunning, and sheer tenacity of a handful of men in machines that had been written off as obsolete before the battle even began. The Panzer Brigade's mission to sever the American advance ended in bloody failure on the slopes they were supposed to effortlessly overrun.
The silence that settled over Hill 246 in the late afternoon of September 19 was not peaceful. It was the heavy, deafening quiet of a spent force. The fog had burned away completely, replaced by the low, smoky haze of a dozen funeral pyres. As Lieutenant Leiper cautiously guided his Hellcat back over the crest, the full scope of the battlefield unveiled itself. The field was a grotesque garden of steel. Charred and smoldering hulks of Panther tanks, the invincible predators of hours before, lay strewn across the landscape at odd angles, some with their turrets blown clean off, others looking almost intact save for a single blackened hole in their flanks. The smell was overpowering. Acrid, burning oil, scorched metal, and a darker, more organic scent that every soldier recognized but never named. Among them sat the burnt-out shell of Sergeant Curry's Hellcat, a stark monument to the doctrine's lethal cost. This tableau of destruction was the only report card that mattered. The theoretical debates in staff colleges, the sneering doubts of Sherman crews, the contemptuous label of death trap, all of it was rendered irrelevant by the hard proof of smoking Panther wrecks.
The crews of the 3 surviving M18s, exhausted and hollow-eyed, surveyed the field not with celebration, but with a numb, professional awe. They had not just survived an impossible encounter, they had dominated it. The wreckage before them was an irrefutable argument that speed, positioning, and well-drilled crew coordination could overcome raw armored might. The myth of the Panthers' invulnerability, at least on this field and on this day, had been shattered by the very machine deemed too frail to fight. In the days that followed, the Battle of Rewrote would be recognized as a watershed moment for American armored doctrine, and the actions of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion at Hill 246 became its defining case study. Investigators from Army Ordnance and tacticians from the Tank Destroyer Command descended upon the site, measuring shell holes, interviewing crews, and documenting every kill. The M18 Hellcat was rapidly reassessed. No longer a desperate compromise, it was hailed as a vindication of the shoot-and-scoot philosophy, a specialized tool that had performed its grim function to perfection under the worst possible conditions. For the men of the battalion, however, the legacy was more personal and more somber. They received no grand parades. The war pushed eastward without pause. The proof of their victory was carried internally, in the bone-deep knowledge that they had stood against the best of the Wehrmacht and broken them, and in the silent, permanent spaces at their mess tables left by the crews of the lost Hellcat. Lieutenant Leiper, Sergeant Gresiak, and the others fought on through the fall and winter, their machines and their confidence forever changed by that morning in the fog. They had written their own manual in the mud of Lorraine, one that stated clearly that courage and cleverness could be the most effective armor of all. The wreckage on Hill 246 was more than a graveyard of German tanks. It was the birth certificate of a legend, etched in fire and steel.